Besondere ist, quer Schultern auf die linke Achsel, damit man den Ladeanzeiger sieht.
Hello and welcome to Bloke on the Range. I'm joined here on the sofa by a special guest, Dale.
Nice to meet you.
Who is a student studying in Lausanne at the moment, and he probably knows more about the fine nitty-gritty details of the Sturmgewehr 57, SIG 510, the previous Swiss Army rifle, than anyone else alive. He's spent a lot of time collecting as much information as he possibly can on it, downloading as many brains of people who worked with it in the in SIG. Just to try and preserve the details of what's gone on, because there's not actually much talked about in the literature. Now, in an earlier video we did the generalities of it, but we have this fantastic resource here. So I'm going to hand my 57, which cost me all of 300 francs.
Beautiful.
And let's sort of start at the start. Basically, this thing is a boat anchor.
I agree.
A very heavy, robust boat anchor. What is it?
It's 5.7 unloaded without magazine.
Without magazine.
So loaded will be 6.7. So you add a full kilo to that.
Yeah. This is a substantial piece of steel. The question is, why?
That's a question I've been asking myself ever since I started gaining interest on the rifle. And it's interesting to really get a more historical perspective on the design and the acquisition process of this particular piece of equipment and what goes into the designing and adoption and logistics and production, etc., etc.
Okay, so what did it have to do? I mean, okay, why don't we just take a step back? In the period just before this was adopted, so the 1950s, it's the era when all the countries are modernising from what they used during World War II, and the Swiss were exactly the same. That in the mid 50s they had K31, K11
exactly
in frontline service, LMG 25,
yes, squad level,
light machine gun, which are actually pigs as well. To be honest,
I think they're 12 or 13 kilos. We'll have to check on that, but
yeah,
quite heavy, also.
Yeah, and submachine gun wise, they had the Suomi MP43.
Yep,
was the Swiss designation of it. The rifles were issued to the individual, and all the rest was Korpsmaterial, was unit issue. And from 1955-ish onwards, they had the ZFK 55 sharpshooter rifle.
Correct.
So, what did they want to do with this? Because I think this is the key to why it ended up as it is.
Now, the exact timeline is not exactly clear yet. Let me just be very clear on that. We're still trying to piece together all the different bits of information from the archives and the books. But what I can give you as in sort of context in general is kind of the Swiss mentality to automatic weapons after the Second World War ended and how it kind of morphed into, well, a boat anchor. So the basic idea, first of all, was to adopt a semi-auto rifle during the Second World War. They started trials during the 40s. They tried 20 or so designs, domestic and even international. They tried the Tokarevs and the Garans, even some obscure Finnish prototype rifle called the Pello rifle, which Ian from Forgotten Weapons probably will do a video on someday. But it was not very successful because the Swiss wanted K31 accuracy from a rifle that weighed the same, which with the technology at the time was impossible to achieve. Let's just be blunt. It was not possible to achieve that kind of accuracy. And so the perspective changed. Now the semi-auto rifle needs to be a specialist weapon equipped with a scope as a designated marksman's rifle. The idea being that, okay, it's less accurate, but the scope compensates for it. Again, nothing was very successful. First, the scopes were terrible because they even tried the periscopic style of optical sights.
Like on the
correct
K31
which are dreadful.
43 and 41, yeah.
And Wild from Herbruck, one of the main optical factories in Switzerland, proposed this central mounted 3-power, later 4-power scope that became the ZF Cars 55 scope, which was also tried on the assault rifles, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But let's just say that on the semi-auto end of things, it pretty much ended. But what was interesting is in the late 1940s, they reactivated the Swiss intermediate cartridge trials. So Führer, which is one of the main players in Swiss weapons technology.
And toggle lock obsessive.
Exactly, toggle lock obsessive. Everything he designed pretty much was a toggle lock. He toyed around with some intermediate cartridge designs roughly in the early 20s, 1922. And it was decided that because the Germans adopted the MP44 or Stg44 or Stg43, whatever you will call it, this really reactivated the desire for a new assault rifle. And they even captured an example and rechambered it in the Swiss cartridge. But again, there was no equivalent of such a weapon in the Swiss arsenal. Nobody knew what to do with it. Was it supposed to replace a service rifle? Was it supposed to replace a submachine gun? Not as accurate as a K31, but not exactly very powerful, up to 300 meters, which is the fetish range for the Swiss. So in terms of assault rifles, project kind of dragged on in the 1950s, and the project was shut down. But what became this was politics. One of the main really catalyzing events that kind of defined Switzerland's defense policy for the next 20 or 30 years was the Hungarian Revolution in November of 1956, I believe. My history is terrible. It's a very complicated political situation, but the Swiss were very scared because it showed that, you know, the Soviets meant business and they were willing to rush in with tanks and crush any sort of small revolution, if you would call it. And for a small country like Switzerland, it's understandable.
Only 300 kilometers from the Iron Curtain.
Precisely. So the Swiss crapped their pants, and they did crap their pants in December of 1956. That was the main date for our rifle right here, because it involved the unlocking of several tens of millions of Swiss francs of emergency money, and it's packaged together as a Sofortprogramm, or Programme d'urgence, emergency program. It's literally a knee-jerk reaction. There's no other way to put it. The Swiss were trialing around different types of rifles from Waffenfabrik Bern and SIG. I don't say SIG because that refers to the American company. It's an acronym, so SIG. But the 1956 Sofortprogramm really pushed forward. Everything that is experimental and unproven, we move aside, and we focus on what is best right now, what we can acquire for as little money as possible, for, you know, as much effectiveness as possible. And so on the table, there were two rifles. There was the late Waffenfabrik Bern assault rifle prototype. When I mean assault rifle, I mean automatic rifle in the Swiss sense. These had a side-mounted magazine, kind of like an FG42 style, although the later variants kind of departed away from it. Initially, it was a tilt lock, modified to a rotating lock, all the bells and whistles. And you also had the AM55, which was the chief engineer's Rudolf Amsler's kind of brainchild, in a sense. He was the one who came up with the idea. And really what defined the choice, what won the bid, was SIG because of unit cost, unit price. It was literally half the price of the Waffenfabrik Bern model.
And it's still an expensive
It's still
rifle.
a very expensive
If I
rifle.
remember rightly, 3,000 francs in late 50s money. Was it 1,000?
That is another very good question. But just to be short, it was roughly around 500, 700 francs at the time, whereas the Waffenfabrik Bern was 1,500, which is a ridiculous amount of money, especially when you count that for inflation.
I remember now you told me previously that when you look at figures, it's often the cost per unit varied by tranche. And the first,
Exactly.
I probably remember the figure from the first tranche, which were
It was 570 per rifle, not including R&D, because the very first rifles not only included R&D costs, but also all the tooling and setup, because what takes to manufacture 100,000 or even more rifles is just tremendous. And so they had to factor in costs. So the final price was 750 or so Swiss francs per rifle in 1957. So if you want to reference, it's times 4 for inflation. So the first rifles were about $3,000, and as they produced more and more of these, it floated around the 2,000, 2,500. But it's a very expensive rifle, that's for sure. So yeah, that's it. It's just politics, and it was very rushed. That's why the rifle kind of looks finished, but also very rough. It's got all sorts of bits and bobs cobbled together, but it works very well. The engineers did their job, but it was a very rushed project. That's the short of it. The engineers at the time told me they worked their butts off. Really, they did. They sent prototypes. Prototypes came back completely destroyed. They had to rebuild them because they did not have money to build new ones, and send them back again, do small improvements, and then boom, production series starts. So that's the short of it.
So in terms of design, what did it have to replace?
This requirement kind of changed as time went on. The initial idea was to make, we're talking about true assault rifles here, so with intermediate cartridges, they called them schwere Maschinenpistole. So basically a souped up
heavy submachine gun.
Souped up submachine gun. But when the GP11 cartridge was retained, also for political reasons, because of 7.62 NATO adoption, that ended a lot of projects in Europe, including the Swiss assault rifle trials, all by the way. Really kind of define what the rifle is right now. Because when you think about it, the defining document, really, do you have it right here, is this, written in December of 1956, I believe, January of 1956. And this basically defined what the Swiss assault rifle is going to be, and it's going to be the universal infantryman's weapon. So it's going to replace the Carabiner 31 short rifles, the LMG 25 light machine guns, and also the various variants of submachine gun. So this is supposed to be the do-all general purpose rifle that also has the added bonus of extended range rifle grenade launching. So in a 5.7 kilogram package, you can say from that perspective, it's quite a significant achievement.
Yeah, I mean, I've not had the pleasure of shooting one full auto yet in the original configuration, but I've watched other people shoot them full auto, and it's amazingly stable.
It's beautiful, yeah.
Amazingly stable. And actually, this is the reason why the bipod can be moved from a rifle position, which these days we think of a position back here as silly, but according to their thinking at the time, their doctrine, it enabled to swing easily, to shoot up and downhill a lot.
Exactly.
That's up. We can put it in the forward position for the light machine gun roll.
Correct.
Now, for a very long time, I believe I'm correct in saying that in the Feldschießen and the Obligatorisch, you had to shoot from the rear position.
That is correct, yeah.
Because that was the rifle position, and it was a rifle. It was a rifle shooting event. So you had to shoot from the rear. But I really want to fire one full auto at some point, just to.
It's mechanically speaking, the weapon is made for full auto. That's the important thing to understand, is that this is a scaled down light machine gun of sorts, not exactly a scaled up battle rifle. If you see it from that perspective, everything kind of makes sense.
Yeah, when you see the Pflichtenheft, the cahier de charge, the tender requirements, it fulfills the Ronseal test, to use some British slang. That it does exactly what it says on the tin. It fulfills it, but by necessity, it is a boat anchor, which is why it can handle full auto fire reasonably. I mean, it's, to a certain degree, it's like the M14/M15 program, but the other way around.
Exactly.
Because they tried to do everything with the M14 and M15, but it was too light. This just says, stuff it. We can have an almost 6 kilo rifle, and the rifle grenades. You actually have a couple of practice ones there.
Correct.
And the size of these things.
This is my forearm for comparison. Yours too. Yeah, these are larger than both our forearms.
These are massive. How much do they weigh?
They're 1.16 kilos nominally.
And a normal one, like an Energer?
Energer would be 700, 800 grams.
Yeah. And what they had with the K31 and K11 was something similar to that.
700, 750, yeah.
So if we sleeve this over...
It's no joke.
It is no joke. So this also determines weight and the fact it's got a rubber butt.
Correct.
A very compressible rubber butt. And I think we shall insert some of that slow-mo footage here.
It's a patented design. They tried with standard issue wooden stocks and steel stocks even, but after only 13 K31 rifle grenades, I mind you, so lighter, lower recoil ones, they bent or broke. And so, with their brilliant minds, they thought of a solid rubber buttstock with pre-programmed deformation areas. We'll show the video of it, of slow motion footage. But it's really quite an amazing piece of technology right here. It's basically a hydraulic buffer in a rifle.
Yeah, it's really quite impressive to watch it, and then with the various live fire sort of propaganda things, I've shown some of them before. What's interesting with the things like Kampf der Infanterie and Wehrhaft der Schweiz,
yeah, correct.
it's all live fire, or almost all live fire, and you can tell from the way the rifle's recoiling. And there's one bit in, I think it's Kampf der Infanterie. There's a guy shooting on the table here, and he's holding it like this, and he's just giving it loads full auto, and the rifle just
barely moves.
It's incredible in something quite this light, because for a machine gun it's super light.
Yeah, exactly.
For a rifle it's super heavy. So in terms of design features, I think we mentioned this in the previous video.
Correct.
But let's go over it again.
Sure.
There's a whole bunch of interesting bits taken from places.
Exactly.
Like the sights are very similar to the FG42.
The FG42.
The overall inline construction is very FG42, and the fact that the previous models they were playing with side-mounted magazines, they were very much impressed by
exactly
the FG42. And as Ian says, the hype is real. I've not had the pleasure to fire one live yet, but hopefully the day will come. But then there's some very interesting things going on in the rear sights, aren't there?
This rear sight is a complete monstrosity. It's 20 or 30 or so parts. A Makarov pistol has 23. Just to say, this has as many parts as a service handgun. And these were actually subcontracted to a measuring tool company, Teza, actually, which is still in business. For you machinists out there, you might know the fine quality of their Swiss tools. And these have progressive increments because of the Pflichtenheft, the requirements. And so between the different ranges, you have various, let's just say, increments of adjustment, which is not easy to achieve mechanically speaking.
Yeah, so the same angle turn on the drum, you move from like 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400, 400 to 500, but it's not even a ladder. The aperture has
globe,
to move up significantly more the longer the range gets.
Exactly.
Just mechanically achieving this is not simple. Oh, sorry, I'm wrong about 100 to 200. That's the exception, but
the increments increase as the range increases. That's the general. They had to learn this by heart, by the way. The one exercise they did was just to put a blindfold over their eyes and count the clicks, and learn the clicks by heart. Set range 340, and they just learned it by heart. That's the thinking at the time. But mechanically speaking, I spoke to the engineer who had to redesign it because the original diopters were much simpler. Like the FG42, fixed increments, one screw thread, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's simple. But once the Army introduced their progressive variable increment kind of business, they had to introduce a whole new technology for threads. If you look very carefully, you can see that there are actually 2 screw threads in there, variable pitch. So the more you turn it, the faster, in a sense, the more distance there is to the actual aperture. It's absolutely crazy.
Other bits that come from other places. Obviously, it's a roller delayed blowback. So Sturmgewehr 45, Setme, except.
Now, the fundamental question is, where did the inspiration came from? And it's interesting to actually read. It's actually interesting to read Rudolf Amsler, which I remind is the chief engineer who was responsible for this project. What were the origins of this roller delayed system? And it's actually the MG45.
Oh, the MG45.
Correct. So which explains the square bolt. The main influence for this rifle, FG42, I agree. But I would say the twist style, the buttstock, the inline design was also incorporated in the German general purpose machine guns. And so, interestingly enough, the very first AM55 prototypes, which what they called it internally before they changed over to the SIG 510 designation, used modified MG42 bolts. Because the Swiss toyed around with the MG42 design, Waffenfabrikbahn and SIG, which became the MG51, so they had access to MG42s, and they were aware of simplifications from the Germans to a half-locked or roller-delayed setup. So this system right here has more to do with the MG42 than the Sturmgewehr 45 or the Gerät 06, so-called. Which is pretty interesting because that means that this started out as a machine gun bolt, not an assault rifle bolt, which is the contrary to what a G3 bolt is, kind of a scaled up assault rifle bolt. This was supposed to be rifle caliber.
You can see the link from the Gerät 06 / Sturmgewehr 45 and the G3 bolt. It really is more or less a scaled up version of the other. The strange wipey ejector, where'd that come from?
Again, it has to do with the requirements. Requirements were the rifle had to eject softly, which on a roller delayed blowback rifle is very difficult to achieve without any sort of weird, funky mechanical stuff, and the Swiss did this quite nicely. We also have the slow motion footage of the whole kinematics of the bolt with a cutaway. It's a receiver, which is pretty impressive. We'll cut that in.
G3s, by the way, eject really violently.
Exactly.
I have actually caught empties from a G3 in the chest in a t-shirt, and it didn't do damage, but it went ow. They come out really fast.
You can understand that for the Swiss, especially in neat little firing ranges, it's not exactly to their interest to have the rifle toss the brass out to 3 lanes downwards.
Yeah, it really just does flop them out the side. Base first.
Exactly, base first, which is the secret to the softness of sorts. And the only way really to achieve this is through a very unusual ejection system. There is no technical extractor in this system. That's one of the advantages of roller delay blowback, is that as long as the case is well supported, it pretty much extracts itself. That's the whole purpose.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realise that the extractor on a blowback is there to support the case and to enable you to extract an unfired round. That the people often say things like, and the extractor rips the case head off. Which is not the case because the extractor is passive.
The case stretches itself beyond its design parameters.
The case grips the front of the chamber and blows its own back off. It doesn't get ripped off. If it was being ripped, it would be ripped through. Which on occasions AR-15s will do this. They'll tear through the rim if the brass is a bit soft and the case hangs up in the chamber. Obviously avoided in most delayed blowback systems with
fluted chamber,
floating the gas, and prior to that with lubrication, solid or liquid.
Now, what is interesting to mention is that the requirements also specifying the requirements did not change up until the end of Sturmgewehr production, is that the Sturmgewehr 57 was supposed to accept both steel-cased and brass-cased ammunition. And that's very important because the parameters between these two case materials vary wildly, especially in a roller delay blowback system.
What's the French found with the early FAMASes, that they would really only run well on steel, and brass would just be was pretty horrible in them, although the later ones, the G2s, handled brass fine.
Correct.
But due to material shortages during the war, the Swiss went over to a lot of ammo production of lacquered steel. And I believe I've got some upstairs even that are 1947 dated. So even after the war, it seems they continued doing that. But I will check my collection to see if I'm misremembering. I've already misremembered the prices today, and entirely forgot about the MG45.
There's a lot of just stuff that has to do with the rifle. I mean, the amount of information that is out there and still waiting to be discovered is just tremendous, which is why it's very fulfilling to find every little nugget and really to incorporate it into the big picture.
So last time you were here, you were mentioning that there was all sorts of interesting stuff going on with the muzzle brake.
Correct.
And it is a muzzle brake with flash suppression capability. It's not a flash suppressor with muzzle brake capability. It's designed as a brake.
So now this has to do with Amsler's vision of the rifle. Because interestingly, the very early AM55 prototypes only weighed 4.3 kilos, so it wasn't exactly his choice to make it heavy. And so when you have that light of a rifle, it is interesting to reduce as much recoil as possible. And this is done through all the choreography of parts inside the rifle, which is why it's so beautiful, is that the roller delayed system is very well designed. And when you pair that with a very effective muzzle, very simple and effective muzzle device, it's pretty much a banger right there.
And you know how effective they are when you're lying down next to one.
Exactly.
Because the more unpleasant a muzzle brake is for your neighbours, the more effective it is.
Pretty much.
By definition. But it also has to interface with the rifle grenades.
Correct. So this is one of the difficulties, and one of the peculiarities with the Sturmgewehr muzzle device is that it's integrally machined into the barrel. Everything here is one solid part. If you take, for example, the G3 rifle, the rifle grenade slip ring is integrated in the birdcage flash hider, which is threaded on. But the Swiss really went out of their way to integrally machine into it, and when you look at the drawings of the barrel, the tolerances in there are absolutely ridiculous. Just the amount of effort they have to put through to make this is really quite incredible. But the standardized diameter right here of 22 millimeters kind of imply that they probably meant this to be compatible with NATO standard rifle grenades, but
it wouldn't surprise me because the Swiss, despite being neutral, aligned with NATO
exactly
in as many areas as they could. They didn't with caliber until the Sturmgewehr 90, and even then their ammo isn't NATO spec because it's got a conventional FMJ.
correct
for improved accuracy. So it's not NATO standard SS-109 fodder. But they trained with NATO. They did Kampfsport Commando competitions in NATO countries. The jets were NATO. They trained. Their pilots trained with NATO. That just because you're neutral doesn't mean that you can't accurately assess who you're going to be fighting against. That's something people really don't get about Swiss neutrality and neutrality politics. That it doesn't mean you have to
be on your own.
Yeah, you don't have to be isolationist. You don't have to. Okay, you can't officially say, okay, we're equipping ourselves and aligning ourselves against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But as long as you don't say it, it's fine. You can do it.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what they did during the Second World War. Because of the political situation, being surrounded by the Axis, they did the same thing. The Swiss mobilized the army against Germany. They had an illegal agreement with the French. Once France fell, like everything was aligned against Germany. They just couldn't say the enemy because that was against neutrality.
Diplomatically incorrect.
It was diplomatically incorrect, but they didn't have to pretend. And a lot of the revisionism since the 90s is rather annoying on this front of claiming that Switzerland wasn't neutral, blah blah blah, because they traded with Germany. Well, yeah, because they had to not die of starvation or cold.
That's kind of the main purpose of surviving.
Exactly. But anyway, on that little
anecdote,
that little digression, Dale is also an expert on the rifle grenades, and I think we'll save that for another day because there's all sorts of.
It's fascinating.
These are huge.
This is a weapon on its own, to be honest.
Let's just quickly do the basis of this. So, infantrymen, did they all carry these?
Depends on the loadout, but the basic idea is the whole purpose of a rifle grenades in general is without modification to the standard, and that's very important, firearm, to basically have extra firepower.
Anti-tank capability.
Anti-tank, anti-personnel, and smoke. These are the three varieties of combat ammo.
But if you think of what the Warsaw Pact's tactics were, it was drive armoured vehicles full of troops as close as they could get to enemy positions, debust them, and have them run in, firing on the move while moving.
With armour support, which makes it more terrifying.
So what this is a force multiplier for countering that kind of attack. I mean, there would have been no point in the Swiss developing something specifically to counter NATO offensive tactics because NATO didn't really have it in terms of a European thing. I mean, people
officially.
Will be officially. NATO countries' offensive tactics seem to be rather more small scale conflict stuff. There wasn't this sort of mass advance
shock effect.
I mean, NATO's battle plan in Western Europe was to sit in trenches and worry about zillions of armoured vehicles full of Warsaw Pact troops. So this is very much to give the infantryman a way to counter that in an absence of his own proper, dedicated anti-tank support.
Now, what is interesting is to find the hierarchy of anti-tank weapons. So this is detailed in some of the manuals. And what is interesting is that the Swiss positioning on the rifle grenade is that it's the lowest best available anti-tank weapon before improvised techniques, which include Molotov cocktails. So basically, this is your last resort. If your rocket launcher, which is more a company-based weapon, it's incorporated in one single squad in the company. If your rocket launcher is down, well, you have two of these in your combat vest that I'm carrying, depending on your loadout, and you have a decent chance, actually, against the armored vehicles, because the rifle grenades, the anti-tank varieties, can penetrate 300 millimeters of steel armor, RHA to be more precise, and they have the same warheads as the rockets. So the effectiveness is the same, you're just using a different launcher.
And the effective range?
Effective range, here's the more hazy part. What is important to mention is that what is interesting about these M58 rifle grenades, the Gewehrgranaten 58, is that they're all equipped, at least for the combat ammo, with a rocket booster. Not only are these the heaviest rifle grenades, they also have a rocket motor inside them. So you technically, this is a rocket for about 100 milliseconds. That's the idea. So instead of just relying on the launching cartridge, which is basically a cartridge with no bullet, you also have a rocket motor that pushes this to 70 meters per second. 1.16 kilogram projectile from a rifle that is of average weight, which is pretty terrifying to fire. So the effective range that you can expect of an average infantryman is 50 meters, but officially it's 100 meters. But I can tell you that a tank at a 100 meters that's moving is very small and very difficult to hit. And when you take into account the fact that rifle grenades takes a few seconds to get there, fat chance.
Yeah. And in indirect fire?
Indirect fire, what's interesting about this whole rocket booster assembly is that the soldier can select whether he wants to use this rocket booster, or not.
Mm-hmm.
But with the rocket motor, you can expect a range of roughly 400 meters, which is pretty decent. And without the rocket motor, it's about 140 meters. And this is reflected on the bipod that Mike is showing right now.
What we've got there is a scale on the bipod, and you hang your Swiss Army knife off the bayonet lug. And aim it roughly, and then use the winter trigger, which folds out there, so that it doesn't break your hand.
Which is pretty convenient.
Yeah. Not breaking your hand is a big deal, but that was part of the spec, was it not? Was the winter trigger?
This is technically not exactly a winter trigger. They only call it this for simplification.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of this lever, this trigger lever, that's what they called it initially, is to fire rifle grenades without breaking your index finger off. Because that was the main issue with the Carbiner 31 and 11 rifle grenades as well. The idea was you just kind of stuck your finger in there and just coax it off. Lots of injuries with the index finger. And this is basically an index finger saver. With the short grenade launching magazine, you basically have open space.
Yeah. Have we got one?
We do. This requires a special magazine, by the way, which makes it even more interesting.
We'll do this in detail another time if Dan will come back, because the rifle grenades are just such a fascinating topic. So we'll sort of do an overview here, and of the big points. So the bend in the trigger lever is away from the magazine. Exactly.
So when the weapon recoils, the index finger just is clear from anything.
Yeah.
So that's really this whole thing was made for rifle grenades and automatic fire, which again explains the weight.
And with K31 accuracy, which is the infantry force multiplier against.
Pretty crazy stuff.
It's really crazy stuff. They are fascinating toys.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's just get back at the plot.
Mm-hmm.
What was the main competitor?
The main competitor there were two main competitors, the one being the FAL.
I just happen to have one here, as you do.
Very convenient.
This is the British one.
Let me just put this on the bipod without it flopping over. But the Swiss actually rechambered a particular FAL in GP11.
There's one in the Roag Ammo Tech Museum.
That is exactly the weapon itself. And the consensus was the weapon is nice, but it's not accurate enough.
And it can't do all the rest.
Exactly. This in full auto fire is a no-go, and for rifle grenades, you're going to break the buttstock.
Yeah, a rifle grenade that big, I mean...
Fat chance.
The Brits use these with
number 94s, is that what they called them?
Energa.
Energa, yeah, correct.
With a launcher that fit on the end,
spigot.
Spigot.
Yeah.
They're really not man enough for it. to be honest.
No.
There's a pouch on the side of the right ammo pouch. There's a thing for the launcher that a lot of the old and bold say that they were basically never issued. It's not up to it. They had Carl Gustavs and at platoon level, and later the 66.
I remember I actually read some FAL manuals just to see what other countries' rifle grenade attitudes are like. And apparently to fire indirect, you have to flip the rifle upside down and rest it against, or at least try to avoid as much of the axis of the stock as possible. In the sense you want to align as much of the stock to the ground. So it kind of shows you, the risks of firing this on hard ground. You'll probably break this. It's not exactly flimsy, but it's not made for that.
Yeah.
The shocks are just too great.
So the little pouch for the energy launcher ended up being used for knife, fork, spoon sets and things. It's kind of convenient for that, or a mini mag light, things like that. But I mean, here it's a two-part hinged construction,
which
held on a pin and a lug there. The interface between the upper and the lower is.
Yeah, if there's any off force there, it's going to break.
Yeah,
or at least wear.
And that is a totally inline, linear, massive.
Exactly. It's a forged and machined interface.
Massive interface between the two for that purpose. Now, in terms of rifle as rifle, I don't think there's any contest.
This rifle is clearly more accurate. It's recoil operated. There's no piston with off forces on the barrel. The barrel is cold hammer forged, heavier profile, probably better quality, at least not for the Austrian ones, which are also cold hammer forged. And the fact that you have pretty much perfect headspace every time, which is another kind of overlooked aspect of roller delay blowback, is that everything is in contact when the shot happens.
Yeah. In terms of brute accuracy, but in terms of a rifle for an infantryman that is just meant to be a rifle, well, there's really no contest.
Yeah, this is pretty handy.
This was the right arm of the free world for very good reason, and that is a very specific thing for the Swiss conditions and exactly. what they wanted to do with it. So, shall we wrap it up here? Will you agree to come back and talk rifle grenades and other things, and we'll download some more of
There's a heck of a lot of stuff. It's a whole ecosystem. Yeah,
you've been telling me about it by Facebook Messenger. It's just absolutely fascinating.
Crazy.
And I think it's great that you're going into such detail on it, because there's literally hardly any information on it.
This is the first time we publish this kind of information.
Yeah, I think so.
So this is all pretty fresh stuff.
Yeah.
And hopefully one day we'll be able to put this nicely in a book in the near future.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I hope so. So, thank you very much for
coming, Mike. Here. Thanks for having me.
I hope that was at least vaguely interesting. Certainly interesting for me, because I'm sitting here picking Dale's brains, because I know little tidbits that lead me to ask sensible questions, and really you've done all the work here. So
it's a hobby. So
thank you very much for coming. I would mention Patreon and stuff, but you should set up a Patreon thing for a Sturmgewehr 57 book, or a GoFundMe or something, because that would be good. You're a student, so in principle you have time.
My parents don't know about this.
They do now. So yeah, if Dale sets up something like that, we'll put a link in the description below. I would like a good Sturmgewehr 57 book to be written, so I will lean on you to try and do that, and we'll have you back to talk.
Scary flying carrots.
Yeah, I like that. I've got to take a photo of this and Insta spam it now with this scary flying carrot, and everyone's just going to be like, "What?" So, thanks for watching.
Thank you very much.
Bye.